This is Financial Standard, the definitive source of news, thought leadership and analysis for Australian wealth management professionals. Financial Standard. Take the lead.
Welcome to the Financial Standard podcast. I'm your host and managing editor of FS Sustainability, Rachel Alembakis. You've probably seen the headlines full of dire warnings of no presents under the Christmas tree because of supply chain disruptions. But supply chain disruptions as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic bring significant financial risk to companies, particularly relating to ESG issues. We talk with Sam MacPherson, head of Treasury at Earlytrade, to see how ESG issues in supply chains impact on company performance and working capital considerations. Earlytrade is a digital platform that helps companies manage liquidity through B2B payments. Hello, Sam, and welcome to the Financial Standard podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you today.
Thanks, Rachel. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Well, look, I've been really looking forward to this conversation because supply chain and supply chain management is actually one of the most frequently mentioned issues when it comes to all facets of the EVS and the G. And so I'd really like to start off with a scene opener. How does Earlytrade assess ESG issues broadly, particularly with the risk to supply chain and to efficient working capital?
Yeah, very good opening question. I think the context for this is Earlytrade owns and operates the largest working capital marketplace in Australia. And with that, we have a network of 70-something thousand businesses who actually come into the platform and they leverage that network effect to be able to access the working capital they need. Now, what we find is, with the businesses that we work with, they're actually able to get a much better or more granular visibility into who those suppliers are, understand their working capital needs more effectively, and then they can essentially collaborate to say, well, are we working in an ESG friendly way at this point in time? Do our payment terms sort of replicate what we would see as ESG beneficial? Are they providing the social benefits to the communities that some of the smaller and medium-sized businesses operate within? Are they incentivizing suppliers to do better from an emissions perspective? And those sorts of things. And we find, that access to working capital has certainly been a big hurdle for some of the smaller players out there in the business ecosystem. So using that is a very effective tool ultimately to drive some of those ESG outcomes as well within supply chains.
It's really interesting. We ran a white paper on the website earlier this year, looking at particularly some of the working capital issues as a governance issue, steward investors, measures things like payment turnaround and issues like that as being a proxy for quality of governance at management level. So I would assume you'd have quite a bit of look through on governance related issues to working capital management.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the beauty of the network is that you can see, at an industry level basis, at an economy level basis, what do those payment terms look like, and what does the demand what demand is that then generating from other businesses in the broader economy for that working capital. We traditionally find, again, if we look at SMEs in particular, very much underserviced by, your traditional bank or financing solutions. Hence why Earlytrade was essentially created to try and resolve, that working capital shortfall that they do often experience, unfortunately.
So obviously, the last 18 months have provided a lot of really important lessons across almost all sectors of our economy. But particularly, what lessons have you observed, or what observations do you have from the supply chain perspective with specific reference to ESG related issues?
Yeah, very good question. I'll answer that in a couple of different layers. So I think, firstly, it's important to understand, what's happened over the last 18 months. So if we talk in the midst of the pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic, what are the sort of issues that supply chains have been experiencing? And then what have we seen, and how has that driven some of that ESG-related behavior as well? So if we look, put a bit of context around it, there's sort of three key reasons over the last 18 months that I see that have driven some of those supply chain pressures. Firstly, probably the most obvious, the lockdowns that we've all unfortunately experienced over that period of time. They've reduced, production capacity. So factories have either had to shut down completely, they've had to limit their workforce, or limit their outputs significantly. Secondly, we've also seen, quite a quantum shift in consumption patterns. So you've had, previously heavy sort of service-based spending. That's shifted, obviously as pubs, restaurants, bars, entertainment facilities were shut down. That spending shifted more into the goods sort of sector. And with that, it's kind of flow-on effect into, we've all seen what's probably most of the listeners have seen or witnessed firsthand what's happened in the shipping container sort of market. Costs are up sort of 3 or 4-fold over the last year. That's then had, obviously cost implications, bringing the inflation story to the fore as well. But it's also caused, essentially this mislocation of shipping containers as well, where you've got, a lot of goods through the e-commerce channel that are perhaps coming from regions they weren't previously coming from to the same extent, and all your shipping containers are somewhere else, and they haven't yet been able to catch up to that shift in demand. So that's the first piece. That's the first piece as to what those or where those supply chain pressures come. And what we see through the platform is we see, the usage of the platform as quite a good indicator for the stress that's being experienced in those supply chains. So I guess to give you some insight, we've had, particularly in the SME space, again, we've had about a 4-fold increase in demand for early payment of invoices that are approved. And you can kind of say, well, how does that link into that? And the way I certainly look at that, and the anecdotal feedback we get from those businesses is they're trying to get, firstly, a level of certainty. They want to know what their cash flows are going to be, a level of predictability in their business that they don't normally have. But also they're trying to take whatever steps they can to essentially provide their business with some solutions to these supply chain constraints. So typically, large businesses with big balance sheets, they can increase their order size, bring a lot more inventory, into their warehouse facility, for example. Now, the smaller and medium-sized businesses, they don't have that luxury. Generally, they don't have a warehouse, or they certainly don't have additional warehouse space that they can use. But also, they just don't have the working capital available to actually increase their order size. It's very much on a sort of just-in-time delivery mechanism. So they're using the platform to bring in some additional cash flow where they can, and then put that out into their own supply chain to guarantee some certainty of supply. Now, I think the big thing that we're seeing, we've got a monthly or sort of quarterly scorecard that we produce based on the supply chain visibility we have across the network. And as you'd imagine, it's flashing red at the moment. It's indicating a high level of risk. And I think that actually flows nicely through to that ESG side of things as well. So the financials are one piece, but I guess if we look at, the supply chains that are being affected, you then start to bring in things like, well, how well do you understand those suppliers that you as a large business are actually working with? And, do you have good visibility of their actual operations? Do they meet the ESG requirements that you think they do? Particularly from, modern slavery has certainly been a big one. And then when we overlay, the supply chain pressures, how are they as a business set up to actually deal with those? Are they in a position where they need to bring in maybe questionable practices that perhaps don't meet their regular ESG standards? So I think it's kind of highlighting, now more than ever is the time that businesses need to be, getting that greater level of visibility into their suppliers. They need to be collaborating more as well. And what we're seeing is, the technology exists. We're certainly one player in that area, but there's certainly others that tap into different areas of that ESG sort of spectrum. But now's really the time. Look at what technology is available, collaborate with those suppliers, and actually work with them to deliver, the ESG benefits that, broadly speaking, most companies are trying to achieve.
It's so interesting that you'd go into that aspect of it, Sam, because in talking with investors, in talking with companies, it as you say, it's really quite clear that some of the operational pressures of just-in-time supply chains can exacerbate risks like modern slavery, other human rights related potential abuses around safe working practices and things like that. From your perspective, do you see these red light high risk indicators as leading indicators of potential issues or lagging indicators? Like, what comes first, the pressure on the working capital or the problems in the supply chain around people and workers?
Yeah, it's probably not an answer that you really want, but it's a combination of both, in all honesty.
We live for the nuance.
We kind of look at it, when we look at sort of economic indicators, we certainly see sort of platform usage and platform registrations in particular as a good proxy or leading indicator for what's happening in the business confidence space. So to give you that insight, we see big spikes ultimately in months or quarters prior to a dip in business confidence. So this is, businesses that are trying to get, as I say, as much certainty as they can. So through the platform, they can come in and view what sort of cash flows have they got approved at this point in time. They can then make a decision as to whether their business needs dictate that they actually want to bring that cash in earlier than they would normally be paid. But also, when we talk purely from a demand perspective, that kind of coincides with, those supply chain pressures. So ultimately, I guess if we think, if we were business owners or business operators, then to the extent in a given month, we've got a huge supply chain issue and we want to try and mitigate that, then we do see that coinciding with a pickup in demand for those early payments as well. So it's probably simultaneous and leading the two sort of ways we look at that data out of the platform.
In terms of the clients that come to you, Sam, how far down the road are clients talking about recognizing some of these leading and lagging indicators, and understanding the connection between ESG risk and the supply chain with this working capital aspect? Is there a self-selection bias in your clientele?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time for that question. I would say the pandemic period has really kick-started a lot of those conversations. It's given businesses, well-intentioned businesses, it's probably given them a prod to act a bit more quickly than they previously were. We do find there's right across the spectrum. We've got customers within our user network who, they're very clued in to the ESG side of things. I think they've appreciated. I think if you look across every stakeholder now, this ESG lens is being applied more and more rigorously. So obviously investors, the ESG investment pool has obviously grown exponentially, but also for a lot of our customers, they're looking and saying, well, we want to attract the best talent, and our employees want to work for companies that aren't just returning good value on the P&L. They want to work for companies who are doing good things as well in the broader, particularly the social landscape, I would say, but also environmental. And then consumers as well. A lot of that those consumption patterns now are driven by what are we now, the Gen Y and Gen Z, who are really inclined to be saying, well, I'm happy to pay a premium or whatever it takes to purchase from companies or do business with companies that are actually, again, doing good things or doing right as they see it in their mind. But we've certainly, to come back to that question, we've certainly seen the last 18 months as a big accelerator of those sort of conversations.
I love that you seem to have coined the phrase "the great supply chain disruption," adding to our list of the greats that the pandemic have given us. Can you explain, sort of from your perspective, what do you think are sort of short-term or cyclical disruptions to supply chain, and what might be longer-term secular changes to the way supply chains are managed, and how this might impact on businesses?
Yeah, I think the most obvious are the ones that are prevalent right now. So those shipping container issues and some of those supply chain pressures, there's no doubt in my mind there'll be a short to medium term sort of proposition. I think it's interesting though, if you actually look through the broader sort of supply chain or the global supply chain network, there's probably a few secular issues as well that are kind of being compounded by these shorter term issues. I think, if we look around the globe, there's obviously US-China trade conflict is ongoing. That's causing a fair amount of uncertainty within the global supply chain. We've obviously also got a big push for digitization in supply chains as well. And I think we're probably still working through, the crux of that at this point in time. But also, even I call them simple things, but a complete lack of foreplanning in post-Brexit UK, for example. Obviously the most obvious one over there has been the shortage of truck drivers, which has then flown through to essentially a petrol crisis. So these sorts of things are actually being compounded by those shorter term issues as well. I think if we step back and look, though, the reality is the ESG mandate has broadened, and as I think I mentioned before, companies are realizing that I think the most impactful area they can have from an ESG perspective is in fact their supply chain. When I look at the supply chain, it's not new information, but it's essentially a network of multiple supply chains. So by understanding firstly how they interact with their own suppliers, how do they, what sort of payment terms do they have them on, what sort of pressures are they putting on them from an output perspective, how well do they understand the scope of their operations as well. That's the sort of first order effect. When you look through, you can then say, well, what are those suppliers actually doing with their suppliers? So, are they encouraging their suppliers to do better from an ESG perspective? So you end up, as opposed to being a one-for-one relationship, it really becomes a one-to-many, and you get this exponential growth through that supply chain. So I think now we're in this sort of, thankfully, we're in this era where that's occurring. And what we're finding, certainly through our customers, is they're realizing that the technology does exist. So whether it's utilizing the Earlytrade network to improve your governance, as you mentioned, on the payment side of things, or whether it's actually taking that one step further and saying, well, we can actually incentivize these suppliers to do better. We've got I guess a good example, if you look at the scope 3 emissions side of things, where companies are looking and saying, well, okay, I have good understanding, good visibility of my own emissions. I now want to do more and say, well, what are my suppliers doing from an emissions perspective? Firstly, how do I measure that? And then secondly, can I start to encourage them and incentivize them to come along on the ESG journey with them? And that's where you really start to get these second, third, fourth order benefits from an ESG perspective, I think.
Is that actually happening, Sam? Are some of your customers linking, progress on, say, labor conditions or emissions management to payment terms in terms of early payment or sort of facilitated payments? Has it hit working capital?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reality is, working capital is an easy sort of discussion. Every business understands their working capital needs. They understand their working capital options as well, generally fairly well. So for those customers, it's an opportunity to say, to the extent we have, what are some good examples? The emissions and modern slavery are certainly the most prevalent. But things like gender diversity as well are coming to the fore to be able to say, well, I want to work with suppliers that are encouraging an improvement in the diversity settings in their business. And I think sort of working capital is the most tangible way that they can actually incent. I think gone are the days where you can take a stick approach and say, well, if you don't do this, I'm not going to do business with you. I think the reality of these supply chain pressures is it's actually putting more pressure, for want of a better word, on those supply relationships. So I think it's more about taking that collaborative stance, using that tech where you can to actually measure what those suppliers are doing, and then say, well, how can I incentivize? And working capital is one option. I guess others can be purely increasing increasing the volumes of supply that you put through with ESG friendly suppliers, for example. But yeah, we're certainly finding that that's becoming a very strong conversation.
That's so fascinating because it's also, in terms of supply chain management, it's also an active discussion that, being as how Australian companies, and particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, are not necessarily makers of relationships. They can almost be takers of relationships with their supply chain because of their relative size on a global level. And so, investors often say that one of the things they look for is durable, steady relationships that have two-way dialogue down the supply chain. So it's interesting to see that conversation extend into the working capital space.
Yeah, I think that's never been more important, to be honest. That, as I say, that collaboration piece is very much front of mind. Firstly, in terms of what we do, but also, the customers that we work with, they're generally looking for, a way to improve those supplier relationships. Because again, I guess if we step back and look from a producer perspective, you don't want to be in a position where issues you've got in your supply chain are actually impacting your end product as well. So they're trying to ensure security of supply, security of goods supply as well from good suppliers. So I think that's sort of the work in progress that they're going through now, is to say, who are those good suppliers, and how can we, as I say, bring them up to speed on what they're trying to achieve ESG wise.
Excellent. And then just a final question, Sam. What do you think that this says long term about this overall relationship on the trade-off between resilient and robust supply chains versus cost efficient supply chains? And what role does technology have to play in managing that balance?
Yeah, this is one that gets asked quite a lot. I think it's fair to say ESG across the board is, it's on the tip of the tongue of every sort of executive or board member across the corporate landscape. So they're very much clued into, the ESG side of things now from their business perspective. But at this point in time, obviously, they're also clued into what's happening, cost-wise, what's happening to inflation, what are those supply chain pressures doing. So I think they're kind of working through now and saying, well, what does it actually mean for my business over the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months? How am I going to resolve that? And for a lot of them, they're actually viewing the trade-off now and saying, well, there's going to be a period of time where I'm ultimately going to have to accept I either take a hit to my profit margin and ultimately pay a bit more to ensure that that security of quality supply from good suppliers. And a lot of the time that conversation becomes about reshoring. So this concept of reshoring, where you're bringing back your supply chains, certainly here in Australia and New Zealand, you bring them back on shore, gives you some certainty of supply, but the trade-off is that you do end up paying more. So I think some of the customer conversations we have are around that sort of area, and that's where we look to say, well, what can we do from a technology perspective? And we mentioned the working capital piece, but if you can come to a position where you're guaranteeing that supply and you're providing a working capital solution to those suppliers, you can actually find that you can manage a lot of those cost increases from that perspective, because you do. The unfortunate reality is there is I look at it as almost an inequitable allocation of capital throughout the economy, where you've got this huge divergence in the borrowing costs of large and small businesses. And it's ultimately creating, a position in the middle where these buyers and suppliers can come together, collaborate to find a better outcome. And that's what, to be honest, the Earlytrade platform is actually providing from a technology perspective.
Excellent. Well, look, I think on that note of collaboration, I think we'll end it there. Sam, thank you so much for your time today.
Great. Thanks, Rachel.
Pleasure. You've been listening to Sam MacPherson. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Please remember you can subscribe to Financial Standard wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.
Thanks for listening to this Financial Standard podcast. For more information, visit financialstandard.com.au. Please keep in mind that the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider personal circumstances. Reliance should not be placed on any content without further independent financial research and advice.